This is actually my third time to be at Selenium Camp. I'm very honored to give a keynote today, and by the way, this is my first keynote, so I've graduated somehow in life. We're a couple of minutes early, so maybe I should slow roll this a little bit, but I don't have any jokes to tell, so. This morning I'm going to talk about Selenium 4, because it's sort of in the air right now, isn't it? We're all talking about the W3C standard, Selenium 4, and I don't want to set your expectations too high. I'm not going to go through every single API endpoint. I'm not going to go through all the desired capabilities. I'm going to cover that a little bit, but ultimately I'm going to go through a little bit of a history of why there is a standard, why it's important, why this is good for you, good for me, good for everyone, and try to go into a little bit of what a call to action for inviting people to help participate. I don't intend to cover too much of the future. If anyone was at the tools Q&A yesterday, I think we've all agreed that the future is murky at this point. Open source is under threat from multiple fronts right now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's getting worse, not better, in this particular climate, and I want everyone in this room to feel like they're a part of what could help fix that. So let's start off by talking about Selenium 4. I was actually tempted to say it's no big deal and sort of walk off the stage, because that's the truth. It's the Selenium 4 change, as far as you're concerned, for 90% of you, is going to be a drop-in change. You change the version of Selenium that you depend on, you change one or two things about your desired capabilities, and then you are using it. There should be no more overt change to you. What's different is only everything that's not important to the user. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but what I'm saying is WebDriver is an abstraction that allows you to control a browser. Everything about how the WebDriver is controlling the browser is changing, but nothing about the WebDriver interface is changing. If you were at my microservices talk yesterday, what I'm talking about is the contract between you and WebDriver doesn't change. Pardon me, I've got a little something. So it's no big deal. But what we're going to talk about today is some of the people involved in this amazing, magical project that pays all of our salaries. What is a standard? Because it might not be obvious. I'm not sure it's obvious to everyone what this is and why it's important. I'm going to talk a bit about the standard itself, how it evolved to be what it is, as well as how to adopt it. And then we'll talk a little bit about grid and IDE. I won't go into super detail about them, but we'll talk a little bit. And then the aforementioned call to action. All right? Let's talk a little bit about the people that are involved in this. Now, everyone knows this guy, I assume. And I would invite you, and please tell him I said so, to find him the next time you go to a conference. This is Simon Stewart. Find Simon next time you go to a conference and try to get to know the guy. He's an amazing human being. And he's usually the one up here giving the talk about the state of Selenium. And we try to put him on the stage every time we get a chance to for the Selenium conference. And he really is the driving force behind this. He's the project lead right now. And as we'll talk about a little bit more in the future, he is planning succession of himself. He's basically been working on this project for 12 years, and he wants someone else to take the reins. So, part of the call to action. But what this slide is actually showing is the year Selenium effectively, I'm not going to say killed or murdered, eclipsed HP Quick Test Professional. Can I see show of hands of people who had to deal with Mercury Quick Test Professional? It's mercifully few people had to deal with that software. At one point, I worked at a company that owned 4 licenses of Quick Test Professional, and we had a couple hundred test cases that we used. And we built this special plugin to the object repository, special plugin for everything. And we had to customize everything about our implementation with Quick Test Professional because the tests were unreliable and flaky. They never worked. And the day after Simon Stewart debuted the WebDriver interface at GTAC in 2007, my team abandoned 3 years of quick test professional work and adopted WebDriver in Java, and we were able to run 75 tests in parallel for free with no trouble at all. That's why quick test didn't make it, because this was a drop-in replacement that performed exactly the same role, which is different from the debate we're having now about Cypress versus Selenium, because they do fundamentally different things. This was fundamentally the same thing, but for free, and maintained by a community of people who turn out to be quite wonderful. So that's a picture of Simon in 2012. And here's 2014, the same graph. You see the convergence in 2012, and the blue line just keeps going up and the orange line just keeps going down. This is when we just stop tracking it. As Dave Heffner brought it to my attention yesterday, one of the big pivotal moments in Selenium history was the year that we no longer were even talking about HP and Quick Test Professional, but the next phase was when they actually sponsored our conference. So here's some people that have been involved in this project over the years. Paul, Yari, Steve, Brett Petticord. Brett Petticord's also an interesting story because he was the one who actually announced the arrival of Selenium from the ThoughtWorks blog back in 2004, I believe it was. Somebody want to correct me on that? And it's interesting because what I didn't know, I only pieced this together a few weeks ago, is that Brett and I worked together in 2002 on a completely unrelated project where another person did this weird little COM object interaction with Internet Explorer and actually drove the browser with that. And no one in the room had seen that before, ever. It turns out nobody in the world had really seen that before. Nobody had ever tried it, to my knowledge. And this guy did that. So I was sitting next to Brett Petticord for about a week while we were watching a person named Jim Matthews, who's still out there, work on this tool. And then Jim and I both left the company, Brett left the company, but Brett, unlike me, went off and wrote Water. Familiar with Water, General? So Water came along, then Brett and Jason Huggins worked together at ThoughtWorks, and I'm going to way oversimplify this, they worked together on Selenium for a bit, and then Selenium, as you know, sort of took off, and then Water got integrated under WebDriver. Anyway, I wanted to tell that aside about Brett Petticord because he's a pretty amazing guy. He's 5 or 6 years ahead of his time. He's changed my life on a number of occasions just through single conversations, and he's just one of the people involved in this project. And I encourage everyone in here to get to know some of these people because they're that kind of person who, in a single conversation, can change your perception of the way to solve a problem. And they're all sprinkled throughout this project. Ashley Hunsberger, my co-chair for the Selenium conference, and there's Simon. And here's Jim Evans, a dragon among people. Dave Heffner, Nozomi Ito. There's Moshe, the founder of Applitools, Angie Jones, Andrew Krug, Adam Goucher, Titus Fortner, Christian Broman, Wim Sellis, Manoj Kumar, Pooja Shah, Dan Futsalik, and Patrick Lightbody, Jason Huggins, Tomer Steinfeld, the current creator of Selenium IDE. These are an amazing group of people. This doesn't even cover a third of the people that I should put on this slide, but I had to put a cap on how many I could actually fit on there. So let's talk about the standard itself. I want to let this comic sink in for a bit. You're sitting around and you're saying, oh, why are there so many different damn standards for how to do the same thing? Power connectors, anything like that. And someone gets the idea, I'm going to write one standard that ties them all together. I'm going to unify these standards. A few months later, it's just one more standard, competing with all the rest. Now, there's one thing that I've been seeing a lot lately. I've been seeing this phrase, Selenium is the de facto standard. Have you heard this phrase? I don't know if that phrase gets around in Ukraine. It's a Latin phrase. It means it is a fact that it is a standard. Selenium is a standard for web driving. The thing is that it is no longer the de facto standard. De facto means we generally agreed that this is a standard. De jure standard means it's actually been adopted. It is no longer the de facto standard. It is the standard. And that's what I'm so happy to say, is that once this standard went from proposed to a recommended status from the W3C, it became what we do. So the difference is that if it's a de facto standard, it's true for consensus. We all agree. Most of us think this is a good idea. But when it becomes a standard, it's an agreement. There's legal issues tied to this now. What we had before was a situation where the tool seemed to work better than the others, so let's agree to use it. What we have now is the browser vendors have now agreed and committed resources to maintaining this language that we all use. So, initially, I'm not going to go into the Selenium history for too long, but Selenium in general was developed by Jason Huggins to test a time and expense system. He is a manual tester. He was a manual tester at the time who, like most of us, didn't have the patience to sit there and test things all day long, right? So he wrote a tool that did this. So Selenium in 2004, WebDriver 2007. They combined code bases in 2008. HP was still king at that point. And what you may not know, what I think is really interesting, is that Selenium was taking advantage of little chinks that would be left open inside the browser back in the day. So Chrome had, well, Chrome didn't exist, but like Netscape or Firefox, they had ports that would be left open for a certain kind of debugging for developers. Jason would inject JavaScript into the responses as they would come back to find out what the state of certain elements was. There was a server-side socket in Firefox that was left open because the Firefox Mozilla team had been experimenting with distributed XPCOM, and this is how WebDriver interacted with Firefox at the time. The browser vendors had left these things open. They were only barely aware that they even existed. So IE was COM library, Firefox was XPCOM. These were hacks. The entire time we were using Selenium up until very recently was almost by accident. But as it became more important, more obvious that this was the way things were going, it came critical mass, and those other legacy testing tools disappeared, and then the browser vendors started to take notice. At that point, Simon and the whole group of people attending the TPAC ceremonies, they would, the TPAC meetings, they would get together and they would bring the browser vendors and they would go through exactly how these things should behave, listening to the browser vendors' concerns over security and performance, and then listening to the testing community's concerns over what they needed to be able to do to the browser. So in 2012, the working group formed with a combination of browser vendors as well as developers. 2016 was the editor's draft, and this is right around the time Simon started using the famous joke about this will be released at Christmas time, right? But he would never say which Christmas. So it became an adoption in principle last year, which is pretty amazing. So 2019, Selenium 4 will represent, whenever it's released, it will represent the full adoption of the standard. And hopefully, the browsers will all be in sync. I want to be able to tell you that it's all going to just happen at the same time. Unfortunately, the magic is not there, but it will it'll take a transition, but it will be decent. So the thing about the standard is that it's been evolving as the web has been evolving. Used to be when Selenium first came out, we had iframes everywhere, we had these terrible, you know what a bad web page looks like, right? So they're not terribly dynamic. Nothing was dynamic. We didn't have the ability to spin up containers, Docker containers with all these things and spin them up and take them down again. We didn't have Kubernetes, we didn't have auto scaling, we didn't have AWS. So as the web has evolved, our ability to use Selenium, or the way we think about how to use Selenium, has evolved with it, which has forced the standard and the browser vendors, everyone, to sort of change engines in the flying jet plane all at the same time. So what is a true statement is that for a very long time, there was a risk that this was all just going to be switched off. Imagine the scenario where somebody at Mozilla who doesn't fully understand the problems that this feature is solving, somebody finds out that that port is open, and if they get very enthusiastic about security, they switch the port off. Well, then Google hears that, and they start freaking out. They switch theirs off. And I was worried, actually, for quite a bit. I didn't talk about it much at the time, but what if my career goes away? I'm a Selenium expert. I'm not just some testing guy. I quickly became one after I came to this realization. But I think it's important to note how close we came on a few occasions to not having this wonderful tool available to us, or having to find some alternative that would have probably eventually looked like this, but there would have been a really awful gap time in the middle. I might be over-dramatizing this, but that's what keynotes are for, right? So the journey is going from a hack to a standard. The connective tissue that brings Selenium and the browser together, formally using this JSON wire protocol, which I am not going to go into detail, but essentially it was the language used between Selenium and the browser, and it was different for Chrome and different for Firefox, different for IE, different for Edge, different for Opera. And that is now going away in favor of a unified single set of protocols that are being implemented in collaboration with the browser vendors. And having now uttered that sentence, I can honestly tell you that in 2010, 2011, I never dreamed that this was going to be possible, that I would be standing here saying this to you right now. And I think that it's a testament to you and everyone on that slide before that we pushed this forward and made it happen, and killed a horrible tool that was dogging all of us in our careers earlier in the process. So I would encourage everyone, and I'm going to pass some links later, to look at the W3C GitHub repo. It is actually a document that is human readable, actually surprisingly human readable. I actually have read over it. I've probably read it thoroughly, about half of it. It's dry, but it is what we do for a living. I think it's important to understand that. And it's also important to understand that it's just like any other open source. It's licensed, and pull requests are welcome. If you have opinions, issues can be opened. That is just as legitimate a contribution to open source as code. So in a perfect world, here's what would happen in 2019 if everything works out right. Selenium 4 will be released. All browsers will just magically start working with it. Everyone in the audience here and everyone all over the world updates your capabilities to conform to the new part of the standard. All the legacy code gets deleted. And then we hold hands and sing. The reality is a little bit less. So we're close. Truth is, we're close. Jim Evans had a tweet stream. Was it February 5th? Dave pointed this to me. I will show you what he was talking about. This is a very old-looking web page, but it actually is being updated quite often. This is every single browser and its current state of conformance with the standard. As you can see, Safari is a little bit behind. But Safari is understaffed, unfortunately. I feel for the people working on that. There's only one person, to my understanding, working on the Safari driver, and I'm sure at some point that'll change. But at the moment, maybe they're waiting to see if this is real, if it'll take off. I don't know what it is. But every vendor has done a very good job of coming along and working with this standard. Let me share the URL with that, because I think it's important, once again, for more people to understand what this is and how it affects everyone, everything. Also, might I add, there is a rather abusively verbose accounting for every single function and whether or not it works on the various browsers' latest version. And this gets pretty hypnotic to look at when you're trying to debug a script and figure out, could it be something with the standard or not? I haven't yet found an issue that was, but it's worth knowing that this exists. I will share these slides around, but essentially it's you probably could search for WebDriver Herald, Herald, and find it. So Jim Evans also, he's at Jim Evans Music, all one word, all lowercase, on Twitter. he is constantly tweeting about the state of different browser implementations and their compliance with the W3C standard. There are some bugs. I mean, there's some hiccups. There's some warts. You still have to set an experimental flag in order to say to Chrome that you want to use this. There's bugs all over the place, and Safari is, like I said, a little bit running behind. But like I said, we have a lot of sympathy for the Safari folks. So why should you switch now? That's one question. I think you should switch because at some point you want to be able to use the newest browsers, and at some point the newest browser will stop supporting the JSON wire protocol. Right now, you still have control over when you make this transition. You can decide, I'm going to start adopting the standard because at one point the carpet will be ripped out from under me and I won't have a choice anymore. And at some point, and we do not know when, the browser vendors will start turning it off, probably this year. And if you're using a legacy version, I mean, I think this is really me stating the same thing 6 times, but I think it's that important. If you're using the legacy version, you'll be pinned to Chrome 72 until you switch. And I also think it's important for all of us to try to be thought leaders in our org, to be aware of the issues, aware of the implications of being caught up and all that. I think it's important for us to be able to stay ahead of all this. Once again, open source, ready for engagement. So, there is the link for the spec itself, and that's the English language spec that's not code. It's not technical. It's a little technical. So, should I put that back up? There's the link. Give you a few seconds. All right. So, how do you adopt it? If you're wondering whether or not your tests are still going to run, the answer is yeah. I mean, they will. There are very, very few things that you are using right now on Chrome, on the major browsers, that will not work. Very few things. It's possible, but you know, I accept it if you want to come up to me afterwards and say, I tried it and it broke. I apologize. I might be overgeneralizing, but in short, your tests should run. So switching now gives you full advantage of the capabilities. It gives you the ability to future-proof what you're doing against the future incompatibility issues that would be inevitable if you don't switch. There will be bugs. Please help us by reporting the bugs. So here's an example of Java. This is pre, so don't take a picture of this one. This is a Java example of the capabilities that you construct before you adopt a standard. First of all, I need to point out that this desired capabilities .firefox, I believe Simon plans to deprecate this in 4.01 of Selenium. He's not deprecating it before 4.0, but he will be deprecating this. This will no longer function effectively. And you give this capability type and everything, and you set the name. Like there's one thing that the standard is doing is trying to put a very crisp and clear, easy to understand key for all of the keys that you can put as capabilities, as well as the ability to extend them. So here's the way you know that you're not running in W3C right now. You see right there, detected dialect OSS, right there. That's how you know you're not running in the standard. Here's the good version. Chrome options instead of capabilities. People are generally migrated to this at this point, right? Am I right? Good, I hope so. If not, go ahead and do it. It's easy, shouldn't take long, and if you did it right, it's only in one place in your code, right? Right? Maybe not, I don't know. So in Chrome, you still are going to have to set the experimental option. I believe in Firefox, Safari, you don't have to do this. That's my understanding. The funny thing is, I tested this a month ago, and I confirmed that I was right, but things change, right? It's rapidly evolving. So we encourage the use of a new object called immutable capabilities that's been available since Selenium 3.6, I believe. There's an object called mutable capabilities. There's an object called immutable capabilities. Immutable is the preferred method, but I'm not going to get pedantic if you want to use the mutable capabilities. Simon's going to call me in 10 minutes and yell at me for saying that. So then you say, set remote WebDriver, exactly the same way you would do it before. And one thing I'm trying to illustrate here is just how little the change is. If you do this and you see W3C on the detected dialect, you are done. It has been suggested to me that the Selenium conference offer a workshop in how to convert your scripts to the W3C standard, and I said that workshop will be approximately 15 minutes long. I mean, so that's Java. Here's Python. Here's the old version. Don't take a picture of this. Platform, browser name, version, and then you get the desired capabilities. Firefox, you have that thing, right? The way it looks now is platform name, browser version. And then this is the vendor plugin option. So if you are a vendor and you want to pass a new set of options, in the old days, you just create a new key in the capabilities object, whatever you wanted to create, and set whatever custom value you wanted to set. That would not be W3C compliant. The way you extend the capabilities in the W3C is by putting vendor name, whatever string you want. And so if you're dealing with a third party like Browser Stack or Applitools or potentially Sauce Labs, you construct a key value pair that passes in all the options to that, and then you add that to the Sauce options. And the beauty of it is that that is W3C compliant. It will work with the new standard. If you put just anything you want in there, there is a chance it will work. There is also a chance that at some point they will decide not to accept anything that's not part of the accepted standard. So at your own risk, but this is the accepted way to extend the capabilities model. So to put a finer point on it, these are the bulk of the changes that you're going to be exposed to when you're trying to convert your scripts to the W3C standard. This is most of it. It's kind of shocking to me that such a small change would actually cause you to be in compliance. The last intended version has already been released of 3.x, 3.141.59, because, they're math nerds. They actually released 3.14 on March 14th. Like, they're very serious about Pi. So, I encourage everyone to follow the progress of the Selenium 4 release. I've got a screenshot of it here. This is the first time I can remember ever being able to go to the Selenium project and just be able to see exactly what the state of the release is. It's pretty interesting. And this is, as of yesterday, all that is left to be done before Selenium 4 is released. Now, the team working on this has all of a sudden, their lives seem to have gotten busy kind of all at once. So I encourage anyone who has knowledge of or would like to start working on this to reach out and decide and see if you can actually contribute to any of these issues that are open. There are a few that are super interesting, like one called Nice Locators. I mean, I read the defect description. It's interesting. I think it's kind of an attempt to give people a way to describe elements relative to each other, as opposed to just giving a CSS or an XPath selector, be able to say the one that is below this in the tree, or directionally above physically on the page, that kind of thing. I'm not 100% sure why that needs to be a part of Selenium 4, but I would encourage anyone to go and check it out and see if that's interesting for you. Also, there's videos online of how to start getting started with the code and building the project and stuff like that. One thing I also find interesting here is migrate from Buck to Bazel. Migrate the build. I'm sure Simon needs help with that. That one looks complicated. So also, let's talk about the grid. Simon has been working a lot. Actually, the whole team has been working a tremendous amount on the revamped grid. His intention was to modernize it both in the UI, which was a little bit atrocious, and to make it more friendly for the modern way we deploy software in 2019. So it is made now to be able to work with the publicly available Docker containers that are maintained for the project by Diego and Dan. He also wants to improve observability, which means a lot of different things. You see observability, you assume it's log files. It is log files, but it's also other dimensions of observability around metrics, gathering, and feedback from the system. And the ability to, for example, go into the interface and switch a node off with a click of a button, as opposed to having to go into the machine, shell into the machine, disable the processes, which is the way you have to deal with grid right now. So dramatic improvements to the Selenium grid. More thread safe. I've been using the Selenium grid for 7 or 8 years. I've never actually had a problem with threading, but I hear that that happens. So I am told that it's more thread safe, and I trust the people who told me that. But that's something that they've said to improve. One interesting thing, and I don't even fully understand the implications of this, but there's evidently no longer a separation between the hub and the node. They are now one thing, and they sort of figure it out among themselves who gets to be the hub and who gets to be the node and how they're going to interact with each other, which is super interesting. And so as we saw yesterday, if you attended Dave Hefner's talk, there's a new Selenium IDE. And sort of like Dave himself and me and several other people in the project, I have not been a believer in record and playback testing since I used that horrible Quick Test Professional tool back in 2003. Because, well, you all know why, right? I mean, it's unreliable, never works. And I think that what Dave and Tomer's work has illustrated, at least for me, is that record and playback was never a bad idea. It just never worked. The idea is fine, so if you give me a tool that works, I think it's a perfectly valid way to construct test cases. Trying to decide if I should go into my rant about how Cucumber is exactly the opposite. I'm not going to go into that. Sorry, keynotes have to lob bombs occasionally, right? All right, so it supports Chrome and Firefox. It uses smart locator technology, which from what I've seen works really well. It has a new plugin system, a new plugin ecosystem. And I say it has a new plugin system because a few days ago, there was a system whereby you could theoretically create a plugin. It now has an ecosystem because Dave has created 2 plugins in the last 72 hours. So there is actually a kind of a culture out there. There's some GitHub repos you could look at. Starting to think about how I would write my own for it. So it should get really interesting. It also has the CLI runner, which actually uses WebDriver protocol under the covers to communicate with the browsers. And soon, it will be able to export code. I encourage everyone to check out the new website. It's actually quite beautiful. And to get to know that project a little bit better. What about Appium? Real simple. It's already there. Like it supports the protocol already. Amazing work by the team. I believe Isaac over at Sauce Labs are working on Appium, and they're doing a tremendous job of adopting the protocol. So here's the part where I do a little bit of a guilt trip for everyone here to start getting involved in this stuff. In the past, since Selenium was migrated to GitHub, this is not of all time, but this is since Selenium was migrated to GitHub, probably 5, 6 years. 434 open issues. Those are open, like not total issues, but open issues that could be fixed and worked on and triaged by anyone in this room. 111 open pull requests, waiting for reviews and waiting to be merged. 116 releases, several dozen just in the last year. 418 different contributors. Fun fact, my name is on the list, but I've never contributed a line of code. I've done documentation, and documentation is almost every bit as valuable as actual code. documentation is, as probably everyone in this room knows, a little bit lightweight on the Selenium side. If you go to the Selenium HQ or .io, whatever it is, the new doc site, and you look at the documentation, it will still tell you about the exciting IDE Firefox plugin that was the one that was killed 2 years ago, right? So that documentation needs help. It needs to be fixed. It needs to be brought up to date, and it needs to be finished. 25,503 commits in 5 or 6 years. That is for a project that was started out of someone wanting to automate some mundane tasks and turning into a tidal wave that changed the entire industry of testing over a 15-year period, killed a company, at least one, that, in my opinion, were not being good citizens. And was always, until this standard was ratified, in danger of being shut down on the whim of a browser vendor. 25,503 commits. And all we're missing is you. So, this is the next topic I want to talk about, just a tiny bit. I don't understand what we don't understand about the drill versus the powered screwdriver. These are completely different tools. This is not Selenium versus QTP. This is not Coke versus Pepsi. This is two completely separate things. Selenide, Catalan, Cypress. Selenide, I'm not even sure that could work without Selenium. I don't understand. So the funny thing is, true story, if you read any of the 3 articles, at some point in the article, they'll actually say, we just wrote this headline to grab attention. All 3 of these articles. That's how you piss me off. Just stop. Please shut down this conversation when it happens. Explain the subtleties and merits of the difference between Cypress and Selenium. I am actually not the best person to give you that elevator pitch right now, but Gleb is here, and I believe he could give us a good 2-minute answer for why this is a completely ridiculous argument. So I had a conversation with Hugs on Twitter last night. He was helping me with these slides. He was a tremendous help. And he talked about how the project has been a relay race over the last years. And I said, I just wish there were some more runners in this race. And that's my call to everyone here. I understand the barrier to entry on the Selenium project is a little bit different from the barrier to entry on something like the Node project. I understand that in the Node project, JavaScript developers, they're frustrated. They're not getting more JavaScript developers to contribute to Node. And if I was on that project, I would definitely be giving everyone in the audience a real hard sell about why you should all be writing code, because the code that you use to create Node software is the same exact code that was used to create Node. Now, Selenium is different. You are writing code that tests other software. You don't have a vested interest in the code that was written to create Selenium. Your skill gap between where you are and the kinds of things you deal with and the kinds of things you need to do in order to communicate with the browser are different. Mine are different. That's why I've never contributed code to it. But that doesn't mean you can't do documentation. Doesn't mean you can't learn, and it doesn't mean you can't do other things to the project. Like, I probably spend 100 hours a year working on the Selenium conference. It doesn't put me in the pantheon of great people like Simon, who wrote thousands and thousands of lines of code, but it is a contribution, and it is heavily valued by the community. People like Mikolai putting on conferences, teaching us all how to work with this tool. Those are all community contributions that are extremely valuable. And another note about open source, getting back to this topic, I tried to get a quote from Karen Sandler last night. She's one of the top lawyers at the Software Freedom Conservancy. The Software Freedom Conservancy is the governing body that holds the trademarks and intellectual property of the Selenium project. They protect us from people using it the wrong way. When anyone comes out and they say, we are going to give you the first official certification for Selenium testing. The Conservancy is the one that goes to those people and threatens them with a lawsuit because Selenium certification does not exist and will never exist as long as this project is as long as I'm breathing. So you are all users of Selenium. Your level of expertise is up to you, but there is no such thing as a certification. And when people say that there are, Karen goes after them. So I did this thing that journalists do. I sent her a text and I said, hey, can you give me a quote about something about how open source is under threat from multiple fronts? And she's like, totally, I'll totally give you a quote later on, but I really like saying that open source is under threat from multiple fronts. So it's her quote, not mine. But the thing that's happening broader, and I said this earlier, open source is having trouble right now. Redis is trying, I believe this is starting to be a thing. Redis is tired of Amazon Web Services making all this money off of their open source products. So Redis is taking their stuff and they're making it closed. That's one thing that's happening. Oracle is suing Google because Google is making certain parts of its Java API, I don't remember exactly how it goes, but it's the Java Android API is being used and abused by Google, and nobody is compensating Oracle for the fact that this is happening, right? Oracle is suing Google for $800 million right now to try to recapture some of the intellectual investment they've put into Java. In general, Oracle is now charging for Java, this open source project that's been there for, 30 years, and now Oracle's wanting to make you pay by the CPU, by the developer seat, for this product that, the biggest drug dealer in the world who just gave us our first taste for 30 years for free, and now they're charging us for it. And then there's license lawsuits all over the place for GPL. Some of these are actually started by organizations like the Software Freedom Conservancy. If you adopt a GPL licensed software in your product and then you sell it and you don't make your own stuff open source, this is a blanket statement, not entirely true, but that is not right. If you adopt a GPL, you are taking on the responsibility for making anything you use with it into open source. That has limits, but those limits are being abused all the time. And so people like the Software Freedom Conservancy are going after people who are abusing the GPL and assuming nobody's going to come after them. They're not being held accountable. And then there's MakerBot. I don't know if y'all are familiar with this one, but they were some of the first people who pioneered 3D printing technology that could actually sit on your desktop. This one is rather old news. In 2012, they took their technology and they made it closed source, so you couldn't build one of their printers out of just a soldering iron and some components, which was really cool when you could. So other companies basically forked what they did and they made it available for free, but MakerBot no longer was updating you with innovations that they had because they took everything closed source. And it's not true, but I feel like they're effectively dead. They're not effectively dead, they're dead to me. So that was a whole lot of rant right there. And I want to open it up for any questions about, any of this, but also about the Selenium 4 transition, how it went, how it's gone, any of the people involved. And I really want to encourage everyone to reach out to this amazing community, especially the leadership, and get to know them. They're amazing, wonderful people. They want to get to know you. And it's possible they actually have the bandwidth for it. I don't know. It's possible. I want to thank everyone who helped me on these slides, people from Sauce Labs, Alyssa Lydon, Samantha Kaufman, and people from the community, Jim, Jason, Simon, and Dave. Dave's still here, right? Where's Dave? Hey, Dave is in the back. Thank you, Dave, for all that you do. So let's open it up for questions while I leave this set of links up here. Any questions? We got to get it on tape.
Thank you for the talk, amazing one. Maybe can you just give more information on what areas, maybe like what clients, like what languages you have lack of like developers? So what areas required contributors like?
Right now, I think we had a conversation about this, but I think there's some concern, and maybe growing concern, that WebDriver I/O is the only way to get JavaScript to interact with WebDriver. There's not a more traditional set of bindings that has been taken all the way through to release that support the W3C standard. WebDriver I/O does, and the JavaScript traditional bindings are in alpha, but that hasn't been brought all the way to close. So I think that's one good area that would be good to help with. Another area is I would very much encourage people to adopt the new Selenium grid and really put it through its paces, especially around containers, Kubernetes, Dockerization, because all of that is brand new, and I don't think it's been tested very much. I think it's been tested, enough to get it out the door, but not as much as it would if it were a commercial product. So those are two areas I would focus on. Third area would be documentation. Everyone in this room can help with documentation. I expect to see pull requests. Keynotes are supposed to pound on the table, right? I do that, all right. So pull requests. If you see something that's just stupidly out of date, like we're encouraging people to keep using iframes or something, I just fix it.
I have a question. So you touched a very interesting topic like certifications.
Yeah.
You see, certifications is one of key success factors of many technologies. Take a look at some agile technologies. You have some XP, for example, without certification, and you have Scrum with certifications.
Yeah, right.
And it's spread so much, so almost everybody know about it. Probably it may be a good opportunity for Selenium to start again as a great tool, like make a community remind yourself.
I think it's interesting. Truthfully, full disclosure, I have an ISTQB certification. I went and took the test. The fact is that certification, I can't say that it ripped the community apart, but it certainly set a lot of people at odds with each other over particulars. We shouldn't be teaching that. No, we should be teaching that more. Those kinds of debates get religious and they don't go away. And I'm afraid that that's what would happen in this community. Like, this community still feels to me like a fairly small kumbaya, like we all love each other. I feel like introducing a certification would introduce a schism like there is between, I'm not going to mention their names, between people who did the certification versus people who thought that was a bad idea. I'll mention their names, Rex Black and James Bach. So, they're famous. They know who they are. So that's what I'm afraid of with introducing a certification. I think if you got someone like Simon and Jim talking about it, they would be more eloquent and more detailed in their answer, but that's my first sort of cut as to why I kind of think we shouldn't go down that road. I am interested in the conversation. I just ultimately don't think it's the right move. Yeah. In the back. Take a drink.
Thank you for your topic. I apologize for my English, a little bit. I have one question, technical questions. We say for using JavaScript, I can take responsibility in only Firefox browsers or other browsers.
In JavaScript?
JavaScript, yes.
You're asking whether
using the JavaScript, I can get responsibility in browser, only Firefox browser or other browsers.
Response body. Are you talking about the actual HTTP response body?
Yes.
I'm a little bit confused on how you get that in JavaScript. Is that part of Selenium?
On slide,
okay. Are we talking about the capabilities? No. I'm sorry, I don't remember where we were. A lot of material. Are you talking about this stuff or?
No.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Back.
Back.
Yes. Sure.
This is fun, isn't it?
You sure?
I don't know. I feel like we're getting back to the beginning here.
Подождите. Tape. Вот здесь. Нет, надо... Back, вот.
Where?
Injected JavaScript into the response coming back from the
Oh,
server.
yeah. I don't think you can still do that. That was the way Selenium RC worked. When WebDriver came along, it stopped doing that for all browsers, for everything. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, that was killed 13 years ago. Yeah. Any more? Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you for such good presentation and talk. Can you tell us, please? You mentioned that Oracle find Google for open source license. Should we expect something particular or similar from Selenium? Because we all use Selenium for our products, and they're not for free.
I think that the risk with Oracle was always that risk. Java was produced by Sun. It was an open source project that was owned by Sun but released to the public by their goodwill. They were bought by Oracle, who had a bit of a different agenda. There is no company that owns Selenium who's going to decide one day to take their toys and go home. Selenium is owned by the Software Freedom Conservancy. Now, the browser vendors could play shenanigans, but now that there's a standard, they won't be able to do that quite as easily, because if Apple decides they're no longer going to support the standard, they're going to go left, and then WebDriver won't support it, and people doing Safari testing will be just up the same river that people trying to use XCUI are. They can't combine that with any other kind of binding. So the fact that Selenium is not owned by a profit-minded entity gives me hope that it probably won't ever happen. There is conceivably some concern with some of the open source projects that have spun off of Selenium that were developed by companies who may one day decide to change their minds, but the truth is that those companies have already released things under licenses that won't allow them to do that. They would have to fork it, release it under their own thing without the same license, and then chances are the community would pick up the free one, sort of like when Jenkins and Hudson split. You know what I'm talking about? So that's what I think about that. Like, it's a potential that some shenanigans could be pulled, but I think it's less likely.